Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PAVE's 90-second AV discussion. My name is Adam Holland. I'm the Director of External Affairs with Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. Today, if you've been to a grocery store or turned on the news recently, you know that supply chains are on a lot of people's minds. So today we're going to be talking about, can autonomy help ease supply chain bottlenecks? Joining us for today's discussion, we have Finch Fulton, Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Locomation, Dan Morgan, Chief Data Officer with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Selika Talbott. She's the founding partner of Autonomous Vehicle Consulting, LLC. Thank you all so much for being with us. We're looking forward to a good discussion on a really important topic today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Adam.
All right, so just jumping right in, we all know that supply chains have sort of been at the heart of some of the biggest economic challenges in recent years. Dan, from the DOT side, can you give us some information about how global supply chains have some of those structural challenges that have led to issues?
Well, sure. I can give you just a personal experience to actually start. Before I was a chief data officer, I was a logistics consultant. And so a good chunk of my time was spent trying to implement software to help people track and trace their containers and do a better enterprise resource planning so they could make their sales numbers and be successful and not have to carry too much inventory. I was doing that, over 20 years ago. Getting involved in supply chain issues now, I can tell you that not much has changed. So I think what we find is that we've gotten better at the track and trace problem, but we're still stuck in a place where a collaboration is not easily handled, whether it's regionally or across nodes in the supply chain. So I know the question for this session is, can autonomy help? Data needs to be shared for autonomy to work well, and so we do need to have that data sharing, that digital infrastructure underneath for any of that stuff to work. And so what I think we're trying to work our way through with some of the work that we're doing at the department is trying to unleash some of that data and trying to deal with some of the things that are causing people to stay on the sidelines and protect their data. There's many very good reasons why people want to be careful with what data they share about the performance of their node. And for certain, we want to make sure that we hear those folks, but we do think we can overcome that friction. There's precedent for it elsewhere in industry. We've seen this work well in aviation safety. When the commercial aviation safety team formed the airline aviation safety information, aviation sharing,
Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing Programs, ASIAS.
There you go, Finch. It's like he worked here before. So that program actually is where not just the airlines, but the pilots and other constituents in the aviation system are all sharing data together with a trusted third party and relying on that third party to protect their interests, but also to share insights from the data that's being shared to keep the whole industry safe. We think that we can repeat this pattern. It's called a data trust in the supply chain space, and that's what we're working on right now.
I think I really love that phrase, unleash the data. That we have to use that more. Selika, building off of what Dan said, what is your take on the current state of the trucking industry and the things that are leading to some of the supply chain issues?
Well, we know that it's broad and vast. It's not one thing. As Dan said, there are data enabling mechanisms that could well benefit the industry. But in trucking, we have a depleting workforce. It is a lifestyle that people don't want to participate in anymore. We know that many companies are beginning to really take stock of their ESG governance. And when they look at their environmental footprint, when they are beginning to address diversity within the trucking industry, when we look at the needs for goods and services to be delivered to us and delivered in a timely fashion, if nothing else, COVID has really laid bare all of the issues and the significance and importance surrounding the movement, the movement of freight. You need produce, you need medicine, all the things that we need to live a good and healthy life are essentially coming on a truck or being transported through some freight mechanism. We need a lot of things. The infrastructure, our roadways, our bridges need to be addressed. Our workforce, how do we backfill that workforce? That needs to be addressed. The impact with noxious gases in transportation, and we know that it's probably the biggest polluting sector, biggest polluting industry out there. All of these things are weighing heavily on the transportation community and on trucking in particular. The professional truck driver who's still going to have their job, they need some help. And I think autonomous vehicles is a large part of the solution that's needed.
You really hear a lot about those workforce challenges, especially like you mentioned, the attractiveness of long haul trucking and things like that for attracting a qualified workforce is just so difficult. You read about it all the time. So Finch, recognizing that technology plays such an important role in shipping efficiency, how can a technology-focused company like Locomation employ data to make trucking operations and logistics better in general?
Well, so Selika makes some really good points. If you are a shipper, like let's look at Target or Land of Lakes or True Value, some of these different shippers that are actually participating in the program that Dan was talking about, they have to prove, and they've made promises to reduce their scope 3 or transportation related greenhouse gas emissions. In order for them to actually be able to do this, they have to track their shipment from warehouse to ship to port to customer, and maybe even to the final doorway. So they need this data to help them prove set a baseline for their greenhouse gas emissions and then be able to prove that they're lowering it. If they can do that, then suddenly they've started to unlock ways that they can generate extra value. They can show their investors that they're doing the right things. They can show the stock market as a whole they're doing the right things, and they can actually prove they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And it takes a number of different things coming together to do this. You know, Selika mentioned that trucking has significant greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation as a whole represents 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly trucking plays a significant role in that, but the shippers, the ocean shippers, have a massive role in that as well. Now, they've become far more efficient in moving goods since they've moved a container from the old break bulk days, but that's still where a massive amount of emissions are. So as this starts to come into the transportation sector, being able to show where the goods are being delayed, those bottlenecks, and then what this administration is doing that's a little bit different is they're assigning cost to those who would leave them on the docks, for example, or elsewhere, to try and assign cost to those bottlenecks, whether it's leaving containers in a place or making truck drivers wait to pick up their loads, right? Because right now, shippers have no incentives to make sure that truck drivers have their loads ready to go, which is why truck drivers who can drive for 11 hours a day, they typically only drive for 6.5 hours a day. The rest of that time is time spent waiting for a load, waiting for someone else to do their job. And as they say, if the wheels ain't turning, they ain't earning, and they're not paid for that detention time. And so looking at a way you can assign cost to those that are causing that delay, that can really help truck drivers get the money that they expected to make in their normal operations. And so that's something that we're seeing this administration in particular push to try and gin up those costs and place them in different places instead of essentially having the truck drivers bear these costs themselves.
Yeah, that's so interesting because essentially a lot of people wouldn't think from like the corporate governance standpoint in terms of the environmental footprint, how data can help how data can help companies prove, you know, the footprint or the lessening footprint that they're having in terms of efficiency. And that's a really interesting angle that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily consider right off the bat. Dan, can you talk a little bit about the Freight Logistics Optimization Works data exchange program? How do you envision it working, and what are the goals?
Sure. So it's been an interesting sort of evolution, and I think it is still evolving. So we've settled on what we think our pilot is going to be. And in the best agile practices, we intend to learn from it and probably adjust. So, which is not a thing you hear the government say a lot. So I'm pretty excited about that. What we've hunched our way into is this notion that a lot of folks have told us over time, especially as the supply chain disruption task force was engaged all around the country and the world, that we need air traffic control for shipping. And I don't think people actually know all the different kinds of layers of air traffic control. It's not that we actually need to move every truck, right? But what we could do is we could get to a place where we could do a better job of strategizing around capacity, right? But that involves us sharing some information about how much demand is coming in and roughly how our supply can handle it, right? So we'll want to know sort of how much we can turn through a port or a terminal. We'll want to know how much chassis capacity is in that area to be able to pick that up as it moves through there. We'll want to know the intermediate nodes that are going to be traversed and how they can process. And ultimately, we're going to need to know some things about the destination where that cargo is going to go before it either goes into a warehouse or into the end customer if it's consigned that way. So, and then same thing on the export side too, right? So flow is really about getting our different node partners to start to share information about supply and demand and to try to take a look at where things are stressed. And so there's a similar kind of thing what the FAA does with what they call literally collaborative demand management. And so collaborative demand management is all about, airports are capacity constrained. They can only move so many aircraft at any given time, at any given point of a day. That capacity is further constrained by things like weather and aircraft sizes and other kinds of things. And so we have to work together in the system to try to manage which flights can make it through all of those different nodes that need to handle them. And so that requires us to make adjustments together as a team. This is not a thing you hear supply chain actors talk about quite a bit, right? And if we're able to start to see around corners and see when stress is coming to the system, we might be able to make adjustments to the supply side of the equation to be able to cope with the demand that we're starting to see, right? So what we've started with are a couple of ports. And there are a couple of different types of ports. We have a landlord port. We have somebody who's more vertically integrated, right? And we have trucking companies and chassis companies and beneficial cargo owners all involved, just trying to hunch our way into like what we can measure, how far out we can measure it, and what kinds of business decisions we could make together if we all knew the same kinds of things. And I think is the basis of the beginning of what this collaboration could look like, and that's what flow can be about. So we're going to try to get this pilot done. We told the president we'd have something here in September, which is creeping up on us. So we're going to learn something, and hopefully be able to report on it pretty effectively here in a little while.
Yeah, I think that that sort of metaphor or analogy of air traffic control is something that really brings the concept into focus for more people. I anybody who's interested in this, I encourage them to check out the data exchange site with USDOT. We'll see if we can't put a link to that in the resources of the when we post for today. But it's a really interesting and exciting program. Selika, can you speak a little bit about how AV trucking as a whole is well positioned to tie into the sort of data-centric freight efficiency model being championed by DOT?
Sure. I think Dan brought up a lot of good points. The issues that can be solved through data-enabled technologies. Detention time, has been a huge issue in the industry for quite some time. Looking at even, the size of the vessel that's coming in and the amount of goods around that vessel. The vessels are getting bigger and bigger. And then there's the issue of how do you offload all of that cargo? To Finch's point, do you have enough trucks to move that? once you've offloaded all of that stuff. And then the detention time for drivers, if you are not moving your vehicle and driving, then you are not making money. They are really squeezed in this industry. I want to caution, I try to say this in as many places as possible. Autonomous vehicles is part of the solution, but it doesn't eliminate or erase the driver. We will have needs for the professional driver for a very long time to come in this industry, and probably forever, based on the cargo that's being moved. But we have opportunities, and we've seen it. Walmart's using autonomous vehicles in some spaces. Industry is beginning to realize that automation at lots of points throughout the supply chain can improve delivery time. It can improve detention time. It can eventually remove this issue of truck parking and truckers sitting on the side of the road because they have a limited amount of time that they can move. We also, again, from the other side of the coin, can say, well, that means the goods that you're going to get, when your produce gets there, it's going to be in much better condition to provide you with the healthy nutrients and resources that you expect from it. And again, back to Finch's point, if you're a company, you have a responsibility to your shareholders and the public. And when they see that you're adopting technologies that improve the movement of goods, that reduce congestion, that reduce noxious gases in the air, that is all beneficial, not just from the bottom line, but from a society and governance standpoint. So AVs can do those things. We have to make the safety case, but we have to make sure that we're not just adding more vehicles to the roadway, but that data is helping to navigate where they should be and when they should be, so that they can provide the greatest benefit to society.
I think that's such an important point, especially about the driver. You know, a lot of people may have different ideas about what we're talking about when it comes to AV trucking, especially as it is in the present, and it's an important point to hone in on. Finch, basically, let's keep the focus on AV trucking. Basically, the same question. What suggestions from your perspective would you offer for incorporating AV trucking into future supply chain and supply chain analysis?
So I will just say, you know, I've been reading from the Book of Morgan for years now around data, everything around data trust and how you can use it to actually optimize your workflow and efficiencies. It's critical. And most people sort of lose track of this when they talk about autonomous trucking. It's not a silver bullet that fixes everything. In fact, the majority of the efficiencies from autonomous trucking is being able to get that truck to work continuously, because right now trucks are generally utilized for about 30% of the day. The value that automated trucking unlocks is being able to run that, you know, 22 hours a day. And suddenly you're able to start really squeezing the asset, or sweating the asset, I should say. But that doesn't mean sweating the driver. So it takes three things to be able to have a successful autonomous trucking route. One is you have to pick where it makes sense to optimize, right? Don't try and boil the ocean. Choose a route and squeeze the efficiencies out of that route. And you do so by separating the local activity from the long haul activity. Because even if you make a perfect autonomous truck, if it's sitting at a dock waiting for a shipper to do something, it's not making money. And all you figured out how to do is how to lose money quicker. So you have to figure out where it makes sense to optimize. Then you got to do the actual organization, getting trucks together with trailers and with drivers. In our case, we're unique in that we have a human-led 2-truck linked convoy. And because we use team driving rules and 2 human drivers around, as well as 2 automated driving systems, we can operate for 22 hours a day. And because we optimize those long haul routes, we can go the majority of those 22 hours a day, actually having the drivers make money. And so if you have to have a system for organizing and a really good system for choosing where it makes sense to deploy, the last thing, of course, you need is the trucks itself. And like I said, for us, our first product is a human-led 2-truck linked convoy. The benefit of that is it can safely, legally, and routinely deploy today. We don't need the federal regulations to be updated the way some of our competitors do, because there is a human driver in control of the vehicle at all times. And so they can handle any of the on-road situations that take place today. And because you can get the majority of the benefits from autonomous trucking while having a human driver present, they suddenly become far more competitive against an autonomous truck in the future. And so those routes that Selika's talking about, where it makes sense to have a human driver present at all times, whether because they're dealing with the customer, prevention of cargo theft, or you name it, just a preference, you have a human driver that it can now compete with an autonomous truck in the future if they incorporate this technology based on how you use data to optimize your routes. It's not really magic. It's just not really common yet, but there's probably $1 billion industry behind this. And when we look at major players like FedEx and UPS working with the federal government to figure out how to squeeze out the efficiencies in the intermodal supply chain when they go from one owner or one carrier to another, that is where you start finding all of those efficiencies. And that's where you can bring them all together, which will ultimately reduce costs for the American consumer and reduce costs for the American exporter, meaning more American jobs because they're selling more things abroad as well. So it can have great values. And I'm so upset that we didn't do this when I was in government. I don't know why Dan was sitting on this until the new team showed up, but I'm incredibly jealous that they're doing it. I think it's great stuff.
Well, I think you came across another great phrase, which is the Book of Mormon, or Book of Morgan, and I want to pick it up if I can get a copy.
Yeah.
Well, you can certainly get the policy that Finch and I worked on. That is the foundation for this. So that's a good place to start.
Excellent.
So data trusts, I think, are a very interesting and unique way. It's when there's not an incentive to come off the sideline, right? Bringing a third party to the table that everybody can trust to protect their interests. In this case, we're using the Bureau of Transportation Statistics because they have special superpowers in law. They're protected by the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act, which is the only data law that comes with criminal penalties for breaking it. It's a pretty strong one in terms of keeping us honest about protecting confidential data. I think in an area where we're just trying to discover what's possible and people are hesitant, the statistical agency protections coupled with the data trust model, I think, are extremely powerful for bringing people to the table and creating a space to solve that we didn't have before.
Yeah, those trust and security and data security issues are always such like top of the mind for so many people. That's a great point. Selika, just zooming out, how do you view the current state of the AV trucking industry? Do we see a lot of major shipping industry players making investments in this area?
Everybody's making investments in this area. You know, I am probably one of the most robust people when it comes to a belief that we will see strong autonomous vehicle usage in almost every single sector. And we'll see it in the next decade. Now, I've been doing this for about 12 years. When I first got introduced to autonomous vehicles in Princeton, New Jersey in 2010. And I know the industry was promising back then, and they didn't deliver. But times are different. Technology has certainly improved drastically. We probably have a better handle on the apparatus of cybersecurity and privacy. And we have just come through a global pandemic where we all appreciate how very much transportation is critical to the needs of our country. One of the things, though, that I think is hindering us, you know, Dan talked about trust. Well, trust is an issue in many different spaces. The public doesn't trust right now. We haven't given them a reason to trust because those of us who are in the industry, and myself included until a few years ago, we were just focused on getting something done, on either getting a regulation or getting a policy or testing or mapping, and not as focused on educating the public, not as focused, as I said, we will build it and they will come attitude. And now we understand that globally, especially if the United States wants to keep up with the rest of the world, we have to do better when it comes to education. Statistics have recently shown with some surveys that 40% of the global population has some hesitancy, which means the majority doesn't. But in the United States, the number is almost reversed, where about 60% of US residents have hesitation around automation. Since we know it's coming, this is no longer a fantasy. We know it's coming. We have to do better on bringing everybody else along. The safety case is being worked on. The technology is being improved. We have Dan to ensure that privacy and trust will be met. We have to get the rest of the nation, our residents, on board with us as well.
Yep, exposure, awareness, education, those are the it's like the drumbeat of PAVE. That's why we're here, and a huge goal for making a lot of these things a reality. So Finch, we talked about this a little bit. Selika talked about this a little bit earlier, but I kind of want to zero in from your perspective on the workforce challenge issues and how AV trucking will be a part of addressing some of those issues, and how a company like Locomation plays into that. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So today there's an estimated shortage of 80,000 truckers needed in the US. It's actually more in Europe and even more in China. And it's interesting because people like to question that number, because there's not a problem with getting people interested in trucking. It's a problem keeping people in trucking. There's many large trucking companies that have over 100% turnover every year. And there's a number of key known reasons for this. One, it's the fourth most dangerous job in the country. There's over 800 fatalities from truckers every year. I think it's approaching 900 now. But also it's in the top 4 professions for suicide rates, top 5 for suicide rates of any profession in the US. And the reasons are clear. For long haul trucking in particular, it's depression, it's loneliness because you're out for weeks at a time on the road without proper facilities. You're not eating right, you're not able to move around. And it's also because you're making lower than expected pay. The majority of drivers don't know how they're going to meet their bills in the next 60 days. And it's because they were expecting to make a certain amount based on 11 hours a day, or at least close to that. And so much of their time is wasted in the most frustrating manners. 20% of their miles are deadhead routes where they're driving to pick up another load. And so they're not making money. You know, they only actually get to operate for 6.5 hours a day. So we can mention truck parking. An average driver spends an hour a day just looking for a place to park safely. And most of the time, they don't get a safe parking spot. That's a significant issue. And hopefully Congress will pass that funding mechanism soon to alleviate that problem. But when you look at depression, loneliness, lower than expected pay, and wasted time and wasted opportunities, these are the things that drive truckers out of business because they don't want to put up with jobs like this. So I will say, being able to separate, all the autonomous trucking companies are looking at how to set up a hub-to-hub model, separating the local activity from the long haul activity. And in our model, which is the only one I can speak to, we're organizing the route so that the truck drivers get home every 24 hours, back to their home base so they can see their families, they can refresh. And by doing this, by trying to address the key points around loneliness and lower than expected pay, these are the issues that we can focus on, and that's how we can stymie the truck driver turnover. And then a more experienced driver is a safer driver. And so we can start a virtuous circle where people want to start, going for these jobs, whether they be the long haul routes or whether they be the local routes. And by the way, when you have these local routes, then now you can start doing the things that people want to see, like electrification or alternate fuels of these routes, because if they're under 200 miles, it becomes feasible. It's not going to probably be till the end of the decade before long haul trucking has a feasible electrification or alternate fuel option, at least based on recent conversations at Department of Energy. So by starting to separate out these areas and really bringing in these efficiencies, understanding how to optimize these routes using data, you can start addressing all of these pain points that real humans are feeling and that have real world problems associated with them. So by using data and harnessing the potential there and focusing on actual problems that actual people have, you can start addressing these things, and then you get the policy outcomes that everybody always talks about wanting. But this is a how to get to the why.
So we're zeroing in on our time here, but I want to try to get to one audience question. We had one come in where an audience member asks, what does last mile AV delivery look like? And Dan, I want to kind of rephrase this for you, because when looking at the supply chain data and efficiency, are we talking about all aspects of freight in terms of the first, middle, and last mile journey. And can you speak a little bit to that?
So I think when we're doing the stuff, when we're doing a flow, we haven't gotten to the last mile conversation yet. But I mean, I do think there's still it is still going to be a data intensive kind of conversation, right? So you know, it'll be interesting to see sort of how last mile will evolve, because I think part of what we've seen with some of the delivery services that have come on board, the mechanism for making that last mile delivery has diversified quite a bit, and I think made much smaller shipments a little bit more practical. So that changes, I think, some of the modality for that last mile. So nevertheless, I think the demand signals that we start to see from last mile can start to feed back up into the supply chain planning that we need to be able to do for what needs to be replenished. And I think start to look toward some of the future demand that we also have to be able to cope with. So I think I'm bullish about the ability of these kinds of collaborations across these boundaries to help, I think, more efficiently use the assets we have. But I think most importantly for the actors in the supply chain to be able to talk to each other productively about solutions, as opposed to sort of saying, if only Johnny Trainco had shared this data with me, I wouldn't be as hard over as I am right now. And everywhere we've been so far, it's been that kind of conversation. If only I had known this, I would have bbeen able to adjust. Well, let's go work on that then, right? Like, let's go figure out what that friction is and take it out of the system. I think that's what we hope flow will work on. So when we start to find the frictions in last mile, I think we'll be able to work on them productively.
Excellent. Well, I feel like we could keep this conversation going for hours on end, and part of me wishes we could, but unfortunately,
Let's do it. I got to go back to work after this.
Well, unfortunately, I maybe for a round two in the future. But I had such a great time hearing your perspectives and all the great information you've given us today. So thank you all, Dan, Finch, Selika. Your input is just so valuable in this emerging space, especially on an important subject like supply chain. So just a reminder to everybody, you can catch this recording on our website. It'll be posted there shortly. You can also find a lot of other great resources and things there at pavecampaign.org. We've got a lot of other new great topics coming up this fall. We encourage you to stay tuned and check that out. And again, thank you all so much to our audience and viewers for spending some time with us today. And we'll see you out there on the road. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for the opportunity.